Hi, this is Dr. Burton. This is part 2 of my argument for God from Logos paper. Last time we went through the first part, we discussed how this paper came about. Now we're going to go through some of the arguments of the paper. And I have to warn you, I haven't written them out in regular words. They're in symbolic form, but I will read them and hope that you can follow along. My hope is that I will make this into a publishable paper, which means I'm going to have to write it out eventually, right? I think so. Okay, here's my first argument, and this is coming back from this paragraph. The ambitious argument of this paper is that either reason is ontological and God exists, and words have significant meaning, or reason is not ontological and God does not exist, and words do not have significant meaning, and one ought to be silent if words don't mean anything. It is not the case that reason is not ontological, that is, reason is ontological, and God does not exist, that is, God does exist. Therefore, reason is ontological, God exists, and words have significant meaning. So let's see the arguments. So an argument consists of premises and a conclusion, and an argument is valid if the premises logically support the conclusion, and an argument is sound if the argument is valid and the premises are true. I tried to use all valid argument forms. You can check my work. Your job is to see whether these premises are true, okay? So the major premise of argument 1, and there's 15 arguments, just to give you a heads up. Major premise is that reason is ontological and God, or the word, exists. So we have reason is ontological, reason applies to being, and God exists. And I'm using word because logos. Or either that, or reason is not ontological, and there is no God, in which case there is no logos, and there's silence. There's no word, meaning there's no ground, there's no rational justification for words to have meaning. And I'm getting that from Aristotle. In book 4 of his Metaphysics, he makes this argument, and from Nietzsche's life, where he spent the last 10 years of his life in literal silence because he gave up on reason is ontological. All right, that's so we have an either or. Reason is ontological and God exists, or reason is not ontological and God does not exist. Minor premise. It's not the case that reason is not ontological and there is no God, so it's a denial of this premise. Therefore, reason is ontological and God exists, or the logos exists. The argument uses a disjunctive syllogism, a valid argument form. Is the argument sound? In order to show the soundness of the argument, the truth of each premise must be shown. All right, so let's talk about the major premise, this first one. Consider the possibility that reason is ontological and there is no God. If reason is ontological and there's no God, then how is reason is ontological grounded? This was the problem of the first philosophers. That whole first phase of pre-Socratic philosophy was dealing with this question of how do you ground reason in being? This was exactly Nietzsche's objection to anything Platonic or Christian. He said, there is no God. Therefore, there's only matter, material monism. Therefore, all is flux. And there is no being that is permanent. Therefore, reason is not ontological. That's his argument. There's no God. There's only matter. Matter's in flux. There's no permanent being. Therefore, reason's not ontological. Plato and Aristotle argue against material monism on the basis of reason is ontological. So they oppose this view, particularly, I guess they both do. They both do. Consider the possibility that reason is not ontological and that there is a God. This is the position of the nominalists. Reason is not ontological and then there is a God. If there's a God, then there is being. And if there is being, then there's identity. If there's identity, then reason is ontological. So if there is a God, reason is ontological. So what we're doing in this section is ruling out those other two positions, the first philosophers before John's Gospel and those transition philosophers before Nietzsche that wanted to say there's a God, but reason does not apply to being. So we want to rule those out, and historically they have been ruled out in terms of they don't make sense, and people have moved on. Therefore, either reason is ontological and there is a God, or reason is not ontological and there is no God. We're left with Nietzsche's view. So Christian theism, and I'm going to say Christian theism because I make an argument for it later, or Nietzsche's nihilism. Now, this is probably plus means I need to develop this more. That's the major premise. Now we're talking about the minor premise. The support for the minor premise will require several sub-arguments. Remember, the minor premise was saying it's not the case that reason is not ontological and there's no God. So we need to argue the opposite, or argue against that. So these are sub-arguments now to support that first argument. And notice I've numbered them to keep them in order in case you have an objection. You can say, I object to 1.1.2.1. Okay, so I'm trying to be very orderly for you. So this first sub-argument is show that it's not the case that reason is not ontological. Not, which means reason is ontological. So show reason is ontological. Okay, so here's the argument. And again, I'm borrowing from Aristotle on this argument. Okay. 1.1.1. It's not the case that reason is ontological. If reason is not ontological, then there is no significant speech. Significant speech means words have meaning. Words are about things. Words are meaningful apart from our inventing meaning. Now, 1.1.2 says it's not the case that there's no significant speech. Why? If there's no significant speech, then there is no meaning. It's not the case that there is no meaning. How do we know that? Because we use words every day, intending them to have meaning. I'm using words right now, intending them to have meaning. Therefore, it's not the case that there's not significant speech. Okay, there is significant speech. Words do have meaning. Therefore, it's not the case that reason is not ontological. That is, reason is ontological. Reason applies to being. Words express things or ideas. Words express being or states of being, properties of being. Okay, sub-argument 2. Show it's not the case that there is no God. Basically, I have to argue that there is a God. And part of this argument depends on Plato's Theaetetus and the argument against materialism and the flux doctrine. Part of this will rely on what I've learned from my mentor Surendra Gangadine and some of the arguments in his book, Philosophical Foundation, A Critical Analysis of Basic Beliefs. So I have many influences. They all come together, and this is my argument, but I'm borrowing ideas from others. Okay, so show that there is a God. If reason is ontological, then it's not the case that material monism is true. So this is not material monism. Material monism says all that exists is matter. Matter is eternal. There's just one thing, and it's matter. And this is what the first philosophers believed, and this is what many, many, many believe today. All right. If material monism is the case, then it's not the case that reason is ontological. And if reason is not ontological, then there should be silence. Why? Because of the previous argument. Therefore, if material monism is true, the result is silence. Why? You shouldn't argue for a position that's meaningless. You can't even talk about it. Words don't have meaning, given the flux doctrine. This is what Nietzsche saw. Now, that's just material monism. What about dualism? This is the view of Plato and Aristotle. If reason is ontological, then dualism can't be true either. Why not? Why not? If dualism's true, Dualism says matter is eternal and some kind of spirit is eternal. There's two things that are eternal. If dualism is true, then it's not the case that reason is ontological. Now, this is probably something that's going to need more development because both Plato and Aristotle were dualists, and they thought reason was ontological. But maybe I can go into this just a little bit. Plato thought that you had to posit the forms to get permanence in being. So the material world is in flux. Matter is eternal, he accepted, and the material world is in flux, but you need some permanence, and he projected the realm of the ideas, the ideal forms of all things. So the logos, the logoi. And this is not matter, and it's not spirit, it's ideas. But there is a spirit that shapes the world according to the ideas. And so there's this demiurge, he calls it. There's also a soul in humans, and the soul is the permanent part of us. So the logos in us is our soul. Now, Aristotle thought that this was too much, that we're duplicating the world by having these forms and the matter and the demiurge, and he didn't think the soul was eternal. So Aristotle saw problems with Plato's view, and he proposed that the forms are in the matter. And there's a sort of divine part of humans that is our logos. But again, matter can't be eternal. Maybe I didn't give this argument. This is one I get from Surendra Gangadine. If matter were eternal, it would be self-maintaining. Matter is not self-maintaining, so it can't be eternal. Now, that's an argument in his book, Philosophical Foundation, and I have videos about that elsewhere. If you can't find the videos, let me know and I'll send it to you. But the thing is, matter can't be eternal. Since Plato thinks matter's eternal in addition to the forms, his view doesn't make sense, and Aristotle points this out. Matter can't be self-maintaining. Now, Aristotle's got his own views in dualism, where you have an eternal relationship between the divine craftsman, which also isn't personal, and matter. So there's a deeper critique of dualism we could do here. I'll leave it for another time. But the implication I want to draw out is that if reason is ontological, then dualism is not true. It's not possible. And if, okay, so why? Here's the why. If dualism is true, then it's not the case that reason is ontological. It's not the case that reason is not ontological. It's not reason. Okay, so if it is, then there's silence. Therefore, if dualism is true, then we'd be in the silence of materialism. But we're not. And so I think I need to work on this part a little bit more, bring out the implications, particularly Aristotle, because he is the one who argues that reason is ontological, but there are implications in his view against that. So I'll have to just bring that out, the contradictions in Aristotle. Okay, now we have the argument against idealism. Idealism is the view that all that exists are minds and ideas, spiritual monism. Okay, so let's go through this argument. If reason is ontological, then idealism is not true. Why? If idealism, then it's not the case that reason is ontological. Again, I probably need to develop this some more. If idealism, then all is one. And if all is one, then there's no distinctions. And if there's no distinctions, there's no identity. And there's no laws of thought. And there's just one being, oneness. Now, the early Greeks also struggled with the idea of oneness. They struggled with the idea of the one and the many, but the idea that all is one and that change is an illusion was the opposite view of Heraclitus. Now, this is not an idealist view, but it is a recognition that if all is one, you can't make distinctions. So reason is not ontological. And if reason is not ontological, then we're stuck with silence. And in some spiritual monist traditions, they say that the highest philosophy is silence because reason can't grasp the nature of ultimate reality. You have to go beyond reason, and that's where you go to silence. So it's meaningless at that point. Therefore, if we embrace idealism, we should also embrace silence. Words don't mean anything because there is no reason does not apply to being. There's no distinctions. All right, so this is wrapping up this sub-argument. Material monism or dualism or idealism or theism, God. So those are the options in metaphysics. And from these arguments I just went through, it's not the case of material monism, and it's not dualism, and it's not idealism. Therefore, theism is the one left standing. Therefore, reason is ontological and God exists, i.e. reason is ontological and God. That's what we get from John's gospel. Therefore, big wrap up of this sub-argument, it's not the case that it's not reason is ontological and not God. That is, it's not the case that silence, we have the word, we have the logos, we have meaning, we have significant speech. If the argument is valid, then there are further implications for reason is ontological and for showing reason is ontological. If reason is ontological, then Christianity is true. So I think I should pause here and do part 3 so we don't get too burdened. This was a lot of material. We went through an argument that if reason is ontological, then God exists. So we are going from the axiom reason applies to being. Reason is the laws of thought. The laws of thought cannot be doubted. Reason, the laws of thought, are also the laws of being. Those are the axioms, and those are what we're going to use to prove to get to God. Okay, I'm going to pause here. Again, I invite you to come to my locals community for conversation, kellyburton.locals.com. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and share. Thank you.